OSPF, like all of the key routing protocols, supports authentication. And authentication is about controlling neighborship. It's about controlling neighborship. It's not about route filtering. So if there's anything wrong with the authentication config, you won't have neighborship. So failed authentication can absolutely cause you to not have a neighborship. Now, what I want you to do is I want you to think about the key players. There's two sides. There's the command that sets and turns on authentication, and then there's the command that specifies the password. Those two elements have to be in effect, and if they aren't, then you're not going to have a working config. Now, there's additional parameters that have to match as well, such as the key ID that has to be common between the two routers. The string has to be common. That's the password. We have to have a key specified. Now, this syntax right here, that is the syntax for the password command for message digest. If you happened to be working with clear text authentication or plain text authentication, you will use the authentication -key. Authentication -key does not provide you the input to MD5, however. Okay? We have to make sure that the type is the same. MD5 on both sides should be preferable. And then we have to make sure that it's enabled on the interface. Now, there's one other big gotcha, and it's the paradigm for the way that we configure authentication. And that's a real problem in the iOS syntax, and they've fixed it. But in examination, actually, let me do a show IP OSPF. Show IP protocols. That's not the one I want. I want show IP OSPF. There we go. Okay, so for show IP OSPF, I want a space bar down, and it says this. That is very misleading. What it is talking about is a proprietary way of enabling authentication. Now, OSPF is a standard, but Cisco in iOSs that are earlier, and I think it was changed around iOS 12 or 12.1, they dropped the emphasis of area-based authentication. They went to interface-level authentication. The problem is this legacy, proprietary, very confusing way of setting up authentication still exists. So first off, this doesn't have any bearing on whether or not interfaces have been individually configured for authentication. What it has to do is this. So if I go into router configuration mode, I could say area 1, and then this command. Here's how to read it. This command says, for any interfaces that happen to be in area 1, I want you to use message digest authentication if I tack that on. And if I don't have that, then it's clear text. Now, that doesn't change the area itself. It doesn't speak or communicate to the rest of the area. Don't think that way. All it does is it affects the local device, and it says, I want to make sure that I have this form of authentication on all my local interfaces in this area. Now, the problem is we don't set the key here. We would go to the interface. So what you could do, you could find yourself being misled by a confusing config. So I could go here, and then on, let's say, my connection to R3, I could have IP OSPF, process, and then I'll say IP OSPF, authentication, message digest, and I say, okay, I want to use message digest. This is equivalent. So the one that we did in and it just dropped my neighborship because the other sides are not set up for this. So this says turn it on for all my interfaces. This command says turn it on just for that interface. If I did message digest key 175 Cisco, that would complement, this command would complement the area-based authentication. But because they're in two different modes, one in interface mode, one in router configuration mode for OSPF, it gets very confusing. So I want you to be armed with knowledge that authentication can be enabled in two different places. The key still exists at the interface level, but authentication can also be enabled in router configuration mode, and make sure that you're cognizant of that when troubleshooting OSPF authentication.